Chapter 8 of my book of favorite fairy tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Samantha. My book of favorite fairy tales by Edric Vredenberg. Chapter 8 Snow White and Rose Red. A poor widow once lived in a little cottage. In front of the cottage was a garden in which were growing 2 rose trees. One of these bore white roses and the other red. She had 2 children who resembled the rose trees. One was called Snow White and the other Rose Red. And they were as religious and loving, busy and untiring as any 2 children ever were. Snow White was more gentle and quieter than her sister, who liked better skipping about the fields, seeking flowers and catching summer birds, while Snow White stayed at home with her mother, either helping her in her work, or when that was done, reading aloud. The 2 children had the greatest affection, the one for the other. They were always seen hand in hand, and should Snow White say to her sister, "We will never separate," the other would reply, "Not while we live," the mother adding, "That which one has, let her always share with the other." They constantly ran together in the woods, collecting ripe berries, but not a single animal would have injured them. Quite the reverse. They all felt the greatest esteem for the young creatures. The hare came to eat parsley from their hands. The deer grazed by their side. The stag bounded past them unheeding. The birds likewise did not stir from the bough, but sang in entire security. No mischance befell them. If benighted in the wood, they lay down on the moss to repose and sleep till the morning, and their mother was satisfied as to their safety, and felt no fear about them. Once when they had spent the night in the wood, and the bright sunrise awoke them, they saw a beautiful child in snow-white robe, shining like diamonds, sitting close to the spot where they had reposed. She arose when they opened their eyes, and looked kindly at them, but said no word, and passed from their sight into the wood. When the children looked around, they saw that they had been sleeping on the edge of a precipice, and would surely have fallen over if they had gone forward 2 steps further in the darkness. Their mother said the beautiful child must have been the angel who watches over good children. Snow White and Rose Red kept their mother's cottage so clean that it gave pleasure only to look in. In summertime, Rose Red attended to the house, and every morning before her mother awoke, placed by her bed a bouquet which had in it a rose from each of the rose trees. In winter time, Snow White set light to the fire and put on the kettle, after polishing it until it was like gold for brightness. In the evening, when snow was falling, her mother would bid her bolt the door, and then, sitting by the hearth, the good widow would read aloud to them from a big book while the little girls were spinning. Close to them lay a lamb, and a white pigeon, with its head tucked under its wing, was on a perch behind. One evening, as they were all sitting cosily together like this, there was a knock at the door, as if someone wished to come in. "Make haste, Rose Red," said her mother. "Open the door. It is surely some traveler seeking shelter." Rose Red accordingly pulled back the bolt, expecting to see some poor man. But it was nothing of the kind. It was a bear that thrust his big head in at the open door. Rose Red cried out and sprang back. The lamb bleated, the dove fluttered her wings, and Snow White hid herself behind her mother's bed. The bear began speaking, and said, "Do not be afraid. I will not do you any harm. I am half frozen, and would like to warm myself a little at your fire." "Poor bear," the mother replied, "come in and lie by the fire. Only be careful that your hair is not burnt." Then she called Snow White and Rose Red, telling them that the bear was kind and would not harm them. They came as she bade them, And presently the lamb and the dove drew near also without fear. "Children," begged the bear, "knock some of the snow off my coat." So they brought the broom and brushed the bear's coat quite clean. After that he stretched himself out in front of the fire and pleased himself by growling a little, only to show that he was happy and comfortable. Before long they were all quite good friends, and the children began to play with their unlooked-for visitor, pulling his thick fur, or placing their feet on his back, or rolling him over and over. Then they took a slender hazel twig, using it upon his thick coat, and they laughed when he growled. The bear permitted them to amuse themselves in this way, only occasionally calling out, when it went a little too far, "Children, spare me an inch of life." When it was night and all were making ready to go to bed, the widow told the bear, "You may stay here and lie by the hearth if you like, so that you will be sheltered from the cold and the bad weather." The offer was accepted, but when morning came, as the day broke in the east, the two children let him out, and over the snow he went back into the wood. After this, every evening at the same time, the bear came, lay by the fire, and allowed the children to play with him. So they became quite fond of their curious playmate, and the door was not ever bolted in the evening until he had appeared. When springtime came, and all around began to look green and bright, one morning the bear said to Snow White, "Now I must leave you, and all summer long I shall not be able to come back." "Where, then, are you going, dear bear?" asked Snow White. "I have to go to the woods to protect my treasure from the bad dwarfs. In winter time, when the earth is frozen hard, they must remain underground, and cannot make their way through. But now that the sunshine has thawed the earth, they can come to the surface, and whatever gets into their hands or is brought to their caves seldom, if ever again, sees daylight." Snow White was very sad when she said goodbye to the good-natured beast, and unfastened the door that he might go. But in going out he was caught by a hook in the lintel, and a scrap of his fur being torn, Snow White thought there was something shining like gold through the rent, but he went out so quickly that she could not feel certain what it was, and soon he was hiding among the trees. One day the mother sent her children into the wood to pick up sticks. They found a big tree lying on the ground. It had been felled, and towards the roots they noticed something skipping and springing, which they could not make out, as it was sometimes hidden in the grasses. As they came near, they could see it was a dwarf with a shriveled-up face and a snow-white beard an ell long. The beard was fixed in a gash on the tree trunk, and the tiny fellow was hopping to and fro, like the dog at the end of a string, but he could not manage to free himself. He stared at the children with his red fiery eyes and called out, "Why are you standing there? Can't you come and try to help me?" "What were you doing, little fellow?" inquired Rose Red. "Stupid, inquisitive goose," replied the dwarf. "I meant to split the trunk so that I could chop it up for kitchen sticks. Big logs would burn up the small quantity of food we cook. For people like us do not consume great heaps of food, as you heavy, greedy folk do. The billhook I had driven in, and soon I should have done what I required. But the tool suddenly sprang from the cleft, which so quickly shut up again that it caught my handsome white beard, and here I must stop, for I cannot set myself free. You stupid, pale-faced creatures, you laugh, do you?" In spite of the dwarf's bad temper, the girls took all possible pains to release the little man, but without avail. The beard could not be moved. It was wedged too tightly. "I will run and get someone else," said Rose Red. "Idiot!" cried the dwarf. "Who would go and get more people? Already there are two too many. Can't you think of something better?" "Don't be so impatient," said Snow White. "I will try to think." She clapped her hands as if she had discovered a remedy, took out her scissors, and in a moment set the dwarf free by cutting off the end of his beard. Immediately the dwarf felt that he was free. He seized a sack full of gold that was hidden among the tree roots, and lifting it up, grumbled out, "Clumsy creatures, to cut off a bit of my beautiful beard, of which I am so proud. I leave the cuckoos to pay you for what you did." Saying this, he swung the sack across his shoulder and went off without even casting a glance at the children. Not long afterwards, the two sisters went to angle in the brook, meaning to catch fish for dinner. As they were drawing near the water, they perceived something, looking like a large grasshopper, swinging towards the stream as if it were going in. They hurried up to see what it might be, and found that it was the dwarf. "Where are you going?" said Rose Red. "Surely you will not jump into the water." "I am not such a simpleton as that," yelled the little man. "Don't you see that a wretch of a fish is pulling me in?" The dwarf had been sitting angling from the side of the stream, when, by ill luck, the wind had entangled his beard in his line. And just afterwards, a big fish, taking the bait, the unamiable little fellow had not sufficient strength to pull it out, so the fish had the advantage, and was dragging the dwarf after it. Certainly he caught at every stalk and spray near him, but that did not assist him greatly, for he was forced to follow all the twistings of the fish, and was perpetually in danger of being drawn into the brook. The girls arrived just in time. They caught hold of him firmly, and endeavored to untwist his beard from the line, but in vain. It was too tightly entangled. There was nothing left but again to make use of the scissors, so they were taken out, and the tangled portion was cut off. When the dwarf noticed what they were about, he exclaimed in a great rage, "Is this how you damage my beard? Not content with making it shorter before, you are now making it still smaller and completely spoiling it. I shall not ever dare to show my face to my friends. I wish you had missed your way before you took this road." Then he fetched a sack of pearls that lay among the rushes, and not saying another word, hobbled off and disappeared behind a large stone. Soon after this, it had chanced that the poor widow set her children to the town to purchase cotton, needles, ribbon, and tape. The way to the town ran over a common on which in every direction large masses of rocks were scattered about. The children's attention was soon attracted to a big bird that hovered in the air. They remarked that after circling slowly for a time, and gradually getting nearer to the ground, it all of a sudden pounced down amongst a mass of rock. Instantly a heart-rending cry reached their ears, and running quickly to the place, they saw with horror that the eagle had seized their former acquaintance, the dwarf, and was just about to carry him off. The kind children did not hesitate for an instant. They took a firm hold of the little man. They strove so stoutly with the eagle for possession of his contemplated prey, that after much rough treatment on both sides, the dwarf was left in the hands of his brave little friends, and the eagle took to flight. As soon as the little man had in some measure recovered from his alarm, his small squeaky cracked voice was heard saying, "Couldn't you have held me more gently? See my little coat. You have rent and damaged it in a fine manner, you clumsy officious things." Then he picked up a sack of jewels and slipped out of sight behind a piece of rock. The maidens by this time were quite used to his ungrateful, ungracious ways, so they took no notice of it, but went on their way, made their purchases, and then were ready to return to their happy home. On their way back, suddenly, once more they ran across their dwarf friend. Upon a clear space he had turned out his sack of jewels so that he could count and admire them, for he had not imagined that anybody would at so late an hour be coming across the common. The setting sun was shining upon the brilliant stones, and their changing hues and sparkling rays caused the children to pause to admire them also. "What are you gazing at?" cried the dwarf, at the same time becoming red with rage. "And what are you standing there for, making ugly faces?" It is probable that he might have proceeded in the same complimentary manner, but suddenly a great growl was heard near by them, and a big bear joined the party. Up jumped the dwarf in extremest terror, but could not get to his hiding place. The bear was too close to him, so he cried out in very evident anguish, "Dear Mr. Bear, forgive me, I pray. I will render to you all my treasure. Just see those precious stones lying there. Grant me my life. What would you do with such an insignificant little fellow? You would not notice me between your teeth. See, though, those two children. They would be delicate morsels, and are as plump as partridges. I beg of you to take them, good Mr. Bear, and let me go." But the bear would not be moved by his speeches. He gave the ill-disposed creature a blow with his paw, and he lay lifeless on the ground. Meanwhile the maidens were running away, making off for home as well as they could. But all of a sudden they were stopped by a well-known voice that called out, "Snow White, Rose Red, stay! Do not fear, I will accompany you." The bear quickly came towards them, but as he reached their side, suddenly the bearskin slipped to the ground, and there before them was standing a handsome man, completely garmented in gold, who said, "I am a king's son, who was enchanted by the wicked dwarf lying over there. He stole my treasure and compelled me to roam the woods, transformed into a big bear until his death should set me free. Therefore he has only received a well-deserved punishment." Then Rose Red and Snow White and the prince all went back to the cottage, and some time afterwards Snow White married the prince, and Rose Red his brother, who shared between them the enormous treasure which the dwarf had collected in his cave. The old mother spent many happy years with her children. The 2 rose trees she took with her when she left the cottage, and they grew in front of her window, where they continued to bear each year the most beautiful roses, red and white. End of Chapter 8. Recording by Samantha.
Chapter 9 of my book of favorite fairy tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by phone. My book of favorite fairy tales by Edric Vredenberg. The Sleeping Beauty. Once upon a time there lived a king and queen who had no children, and this they lamented very much. But one day, as the queen was walking by the side of the river, a little fish lifted its head out of the water and said, "Your wish shall be fulfilled, and you shall soon have a daughter." What the little fish had foretold soon came to pass, and the queen had a little girl who was so very beautiful that the king could not cease looking on her for joy, and determined to hold a great feast. So he invited not only his relations, friends, and neighbors, but also all the fairies, that they might be kind and good to his little daughter. Now there were 13 fairies in his kingdom, and he had only 12 golden dishes for them to eat out of, so that he was obliged to leave one of the fairies without an invitation. The rest came, and after the feast was over they gave all their best gifts to the little princess. One gave her virtue, another beauty, another riches, and so on till she had all that was excellent in the world. When 11 had done blessing her, the 13th, who had not been invited and was very angry on that account, came in and determined to take her revenge. So she cried out, "The king's daughter shall in her 15th year be wounded by a spindle, and fall down dead." Then the 12th, who had not yet given her gift, came forward and said that the bad wish must be fulfilled, but that she could soften it, and that the king's daughter should not die, but fall asleep for 100 years. But the king hoped to save his dear child from the threatened evil, and ordered that all the spindles in the kingdom should be bought up and destroyed. All the fairies' gifts were in the meantime fulfilled, for the princess was so beautiful and well behaved and amiable and wise that everyone who knew her loved her. Now it happened that on the very day she was 15 years old, the king and queen were not at home, and she was left alone in the palace. So she roved about by herself, and poked at all the rooms and chambers, till at last she came to an old tower, to which there was a narrow staircase ending with a little door. In the door there was a golden key, and when she turned it the door sprang open, and there sat an old lady spinning away very busily. "Why, how now, good mother?" said the Princess. "What are you doing there?" "Spinning," said the old lady, and nodded her head. "How prettily that little thing turns round!" said the Princess, and took the spindle and began to spin. But scarcely had she touched it before the prophecy was fulfilled, and she fell down, as if lifeless, on the ground. However, she was not dead, but had only fallen into a deep sleep, and the King and Queen, who just then came home, and all their court, fell asleep too, and the horses slept in the stables, and the dogs in the court, the pigeons on the housetop, and the flies on the walls. Even the fire on the hearth left off blazing, and went to sleep, and the meat that was roasting stood still, and the cook, who was at that moment pulling the kitchen boy by the hair to give him a box on the ear for something he had done amiss, let him go, and both fell asleep. And so everything stood still, and slept soundly. A large hedge of thorns soon grew around the palace, and every year it became higher and thicker, till at last the whole place was surrounded and hidden, so that not even the roof or the chimneys could be seen. But there went a report through all the land of the beautiful sleeping Briar Rose, for so was the king's daughter called, that from time to time several kings' sons came, and tried to break through the thicket into the palace. This they could never do, for the thorns and bushes laid hold of them as if it were with hands, and there they stuck fast and died miserably. After many years came yet another king's son into that land, and an old man told him the story of the thicket of thorns, and how a beautiful palace stood behind it, in which was a wondrous princess, called Briar Rose, asleep with all her court. He told, too, how he had heard from his grandfather that many, many princes had come, and had tried to break through the thicket, but had stuck fast and died. Then the young prince said, "All this shall not frighten me. I will go and see Briar Rose." The old man tried to dissuade him, but he persisted in going. Now that very day were the 100 years completed, and as the prince came to the thicket, he saw nothing but beautiful flowering shrubs, through which he passed with ease, and they closed after him, as firm as ever. Then he came at last to the palace, and there in the court lay the dogs asleep, and the horses in the stables, and on the roof sat the pigeons fast asleep, with their heads under their wings. And when he came into the palace, the flies slept on the walls, and the cook in the kitchen was still holding up her hand as if she would beat the boy, and the maid with her pail in her hand was going a milking. Then he went on still further, and all was so quiet that he could hear every breath he drew, till at last he came to the old tower and opened the door of the little room in which Briar Rose was, and there she lay fast asleep, and looked so beautiful that he could not turn his eyes away, and he stooped down and gave her a kiss. But the moment he kissed her, she opened her eyes and awoke, and smiled upon him, for the spell was broken. Then they went out together, and presently the king and queen also awoke, and all the court, and they gazed on each other with great wonder. And the horses got up and shook themselves, and the dogs jumped about and barked. The pigeons took their heads from under their wings and looked around and flew into the fields. The flies on the walls buzzed, the fire in the kitchen blazed up and cooked the dinner, and the roast meat turned round again. The cook gave the boy the box on his ear so that he cried out, and the maid went to milk the cows. And then was the wedding of the prince and Briar Rose celebrated, and they lived happily together all their lives long. End of The Sleeping Beauty.
Chapter 10 of my book of favorite fairy tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. My book of favorite fairy tales. Edric Vredenberg, Prince Cherie. There was once a king who was such an honorable man that his subjects called him the Good King. One day, while he was out hunting, a little rabbit that his dogs were about to kill threw itself into his arms. The king caressed the little creature and said, "As you have put yourself under my protection, nobody shall harm you." And he carried the rabbit to his palace, and ordered a pretty little hutch to be made for it. That night, when he was alone in his room, there appeared a lovely lady. She wore a robe as white as snow, and a wreath of white roses on her head. She addressed him thus: "I am the fairy Candide. I wished to see if you were as good as everybody declares you are, and for this reason I changed myself into the little rabbit, and ran to you in my distress. For I know that those who have pity for dumb creatures have still more pity for mankind. I have come to thank you for what you did, and to say that I shall always be your friend, and will grant any request you would now like to make." "Madam," replied the king, "I have one only son whom I love devotedly. His name is Prince Chéri. If you have any good will for me, be a friend to my son." "Willingly," responded the fairy. "I will make your son the most handsome prince in the world, or the richest, or the most powerful. Choose which you will for him." "I desire none of these things," replied the king; "but I shall be very much obliged if you will make him the best of all princes; for what good would it do to him to be handsome, rich, or powerful, if he were wicked? You know he would be unhappy, for it is only goodness which brings content." "You are right," answered the fairy, "but that I cannot do. Prince Chéri must himself strive to become good. All that I can promise is that I will give him good advice, and punish him for his faults, if he will not himself correct them." And with this the father had to rest content. Not long afterwards the good king died, and 2 days later the fairy appeared to Prince Chéri. "I promised your father to be your friend," she told him. "Here is a little gold ring. Take care of it, for it is worth more than diamonds. Every time that you are about to do any wrong action it will prick you. If, in spite of the pricks, you continue your bad actions, you will lose my friendship, and I shall become your enemy." Saying this, the fairy vanished, leaving the prince very much astonished. For some time Chéri behaved so well that the ring did not prick at all; but one day when he returned from the chase, having caught nothing, he felt so ill humoured that when his dog Bibi came fawning upon him, he kicked the poor faithful creature from him. At that moment the ring pricked, like a pin running into his finger. "What is this?" he exclaimed. "The fairy must be mocking me. Surely I've done no great harm in kicking an animal that annoyed me. What's the use of being ruler of a great empire if I may not treat my dog as I will?" "I'm not mocking you," he heard in reply to his thoughts. "You have been bad tempered, and you have behaved unkindly to a poor animal who did not deserve such treatment. I know you are higher than a dog, but the advantage of being ruler of a great empire is not in doing all the harm one wishes, but in doing all the good one can." Chéri promised to be better, but he did not keep his word, and so the ring often pricked him, sometimes until his finger bled, and at last, in anger, he threw it away. Now he thought he would be truly happy, and he gave way to any foolish fancies and wrong wishes that came into his head, until he really became very wicked and was disliked by every one. One day when he was out walking he saw a girl named Zelly, who was so beautiful that he resolved to marry her. But Zelly was as good as she was beautiful, and said to him: "Sir, I am only a shepherdess and have no fortune; but, in spite of that, I will never marry you, for although I should be a queen, and you are handsome and rich, your evil behaviour would make me hate you." Upon this Cherie flew into a passion, and ordered his officers to carry Zelly to the palace. But she was not used unkindly there, for the prince loved her. However, after a while, urged by her foster brother, a bad man who encouraged Cherie in his wickedness, the young man rushed in a rage to the room in which Zelly was confined, determined that, if she still refused to marry him, the very next day she should be sold as a slave. Great was his surprise, on entering the apartment, to find the captive had disappeared, for he carried the key of the door in his pocket. Amongst those at the royal court was a counsellor named Solyman, a man of a noble mind, who had often dared to tell the prince of his faults, and had at first been thanked for this. But later on Cherie grew angry that any one should presume to blame him while all others at the court were full of flattery and praise. But in his heart of hearts the prince respected this good man, and this the wicked flatterers knew full well, and therefore feared lest he should come into the prince's favour. So now they falsely said that it was Solyman who had helped Zelly to escape, and beyond himself with fury, Cherie commanded his foster brother to send soldiers to bring Suliman to him in chains, like a criminal. After giving these orders Cherie retired to his chamber, but scarcely had he entered, when the earth trembled. There came a great clap of thunder, and the fairy Candide appeared before him. "I promised your father," said she in a stern voice, "to give you good advice, and to punish you if you refused to follow it. You have despised my counsels, and your crimes have converted you into a monster, the horror of heaven and earth. Now it is time to fulfil my promise of punishment. I condemn you to take the resemblance of the beasts you are like in disposition: a lion, because of your fury; a wolf, on account of your greediness; a serpent, for destroying him who has been your second father; a bull, by reason of your brutality." Hardly had the fairy pronounced these words, when Cherie perceived with horror that his body had been transformed. He had a lion's head, a bull's horns, the feet of a wolf, and the tail of a viper. At the same moment he found himself in a forest, and there, after roaming about miserably for some time, he fell into a pit dug by hunters. He was captured and led into the capital of his kingdom. On the way thither, instead of acknowledging that he had brought his evil plight upon himself, he bit at his chains and cursed the fairy. As he was nearing the city, great rejoicings were seen on every side, and on the hunters inquiring the reason, they were told that Prince Cherie, whose only pleasure it was to torment his people, had been crushed to death in his chamber by a thunderbolt, a just punishment for his offences. Four of his wicked companions had tried to partition the kingdom between them, but the people would have none such to rule, and they had offered the crown to the good and wise Solyman. Cherie panted with rage on hearing this, and in the palace square he saw Solyman on a superb throne. and all the people who shouted with joy and wished him a long life to repair the evil brought about by their former sovereign. "I accept the throne," said Suliman, "but it is to preserve it for Prince Cherie. A fairy has revealed to me that he is not dead, and possibly will return to you as virtuous as in his earliest years." "Alas!" cried Suliman, bursting into tears, "his flatterers have ruined him. I know that at heart he is good." These words moved Cherie to sorrow for his crimes, and he felt that he had not been punished as severely as he deserved, and he now resolved to amend his faults. Therefore he obeyed the man who had charge over him, and who constantly cruelly beat him; and one day, when this keeper lay asleep, and a tiger who had broken loose was about to devour him, Cherie fought the fierce beast, and saved the man's life. Then a voice was heard saying, "A good action shall be rewarded," and to Cherie's joy he was instantaneously transformed into a pretty little dog, which the keeper carried to the Queen. The Queen was delighted with him, but, for fear he should grow bigger, she gave him only small pieces of bread to eat, so that poor Cherie nearly died of hunger. One day he carried his little piece of bread into the garden to eat it there, but wandering with it in his mouth, still further on, he saw a young girl pale and thin, and almost fainting for want of food. "I am hungry," thought Cherie, "but if I give my breakfast to this poor thing, perhaps I shall save her life." He placed his bread in the girl's hand, and she ate it hungrily. Just then he heard loud cries, and saw that it was the beautiful Zelly struggling to free herself from four men who were carrying her into a house near by. Cherie, longing to help her, followed them barking, and although the men kicked him savagely, he would not leave the place. Presently, from a window was thrown a plateful of tempting looking food. Cherie was just about to devour it, when the girl to whom he had given the bread rushed forward, and throwing her arms around him, cried: "Poor little dog, do not touch that food, it is poisoned." Just then a voice was heard saying, "You see that a good action meets with reward," and at the same time Cherie was changed into a pretty white pigeon. For several days he flew around hoping to catch sight of Zelly, and at last, seated by a hermit outside a cave, he found her. Fluttering down, he alighted upon her shoulder. Zelly stroked his feathers, whispering that she now accepted his gift, and would love him always, and at that moment Cherie regained his natural figure, and Fairy Candide appeared in place of the hermit, whose form she had taken. "Come, my children," said she, "I am going to transport you to your palace, that Cherie may receive his crown of which he has now become worthy." And hardly had she ceased speaking when they found themselves in Suliman's presence. The worthy governor was delighted to behold his dear master, and gladly resigned the throne to him. Cherie and Zelly reigned long and happily, and we are told that the ring, which the prince now wore again, never once severely pricked him. End of chapter 10. Recording by Linda Ray Nielsen, Vancouver, BC.
Chapter 11 of My Book of Favorite Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Gore. My Book of Favorite Fairy Tales by Edric Vredenberg. Chapter 11 The White Cat. There was once a king who had 3 sons, all handsome and brave. But it came to his ears that they wished to reign now instead of waiting until he died. He therefore determined to divert their minds by making promises, the fulfillment of which he would always be able to evade. So he called them to his room and spoke. "You must agree with me, my dear children, that at my great age I cannot manage the business of my kingdom as I used to do. And as I am intending retiring into the country, it seems to me that a clever, faithful dog would be very good company. And I promise you that whichever brings me the most beautiful little dog at once succeeds to the kingdom." The princes were much surprised to hear their father's wish for a little dog, but agreed with pleasure to go in search of one. They said good-bye to the king, who gave them money and jewels, announcing that in a year he should expect them to return, all on the same day and at the same hour, bringing to him their little dogs. Then the princes set out, each by a different road, agreeing in a year's time to meet at a certain place a short distance from their home. The 2 elder met with many adventures, but it is only the youngest that we shall follow. This youngest prince was very courteous and merry, clever and accomplished. He was tall, handsome, and all that a prince should be. Very seldom a day passed without his buying dogs, little dogs, big dogs, sporting dogs, spaniels, hounds, dogs of all sorts. When he found a beautiful one, and then came across a still better, he let the first one go. For being alone, the princes had declined to take any attendants. He could not take charge of 30 or 40,000 dogs. He traveled on, keeping to one road, until on a certain night, during a storm of thunder and rain, he lost his way, and after some wandering arrived at a most superb castle, where nobody was to be seen but about a dozen hands, all holding torches. Other hands pushed him forwards and guided him through one apartment after another, all so rich in precious stones and beautiful paintings that it was like enchantment. After passing through 60 rooms, the hands stopped him, and here the wet garments of the prince were taken away, and he was clad in raiment of the most exquisite description. The hands then conducted him into a banqueting hall, where entered a little figure not 2 feet high, covered with a long black crape veil, followed by a great procession of cats. The prince was much too astonished to move. The little figure approached him, raising the veil, and he saw the most beautiful white cat he had ever beheld. Addressing the prince, she said, "King's son, welcome. My feline majesty sees you with pleasure." "Madam Cat," replied the prince, "it is very good of you to receive me thus, but you are not an ordinary cat. Being able to speak and possessing this superb castle are proof of that." After they had conversed a little while, supper was served to them, during which the prince entertained the cat by telling her all sorts of news, and he discovered that she was well informed as to what was taking place in the world. Supper over, various cats came in, dressed in fancy costumes, and danced a ballet. Then the white cat bid her visitor good night, and the hands which had conducted him before led him to a bedchamber. Early the next morning the hands awoke him, and dressing him in a handsome hunting costume, led him to the courtyard, where he found the white cat upon a splendid monkey, with about 500 other cats assembled, all ready for the chase. And never had the Prince enjoyed anything so much, for although mounted only upon a wooden horse, he rode at a great pace. Day after day passed in such delights as made the Prince almost forget his own country. "Alas!" said he to the White Cat again and again, "how sad I shall be to leave you. I love you so dearly. Either become a woman or change me into a cat." A year passes very quickly when one has no care or trouble and is enjoying life. But the White Cat knew when the Prince should return home, and reminded him, saying, "Don't you know that you have only 3 days to look for the little dog for your father, and that your brothers will have found the most beautiful?" Then the Prince came to himself and cried, "By what charm have you made me forget what is so important? Where shall I find the dog, and a horse swift enough for such a journey?" And he was in great distress. The White Cat comforted him, however, saying that the wooden horse would take him to his journey's end sufficiently quickly, and that she would herself also provide the little dog. Then she handed to him a walnut, saying, "Put your ear to this shell, and you will hear him barking." So the Prince met his brothers, and they came into the King's presence. The 2 elder sons had brought little dogs so delicate and small that one hardly dared to touch them, and none could decide which should have the kingdom. Then the youngest took from his pocket the nut the cat had given to him, and there was seen a little dog so tiny that it could go through a ring without touching it. He was also able to dance and play the castanets while his ears touched the ground. The King was embarrassed, for it was impossible to find a flaw in this lovely little creature. However, as he did not desire to part with his crown, he declared that they had succeeded so well in their first quest that now he should like them to search by land and sea for a piece of linen so fine that it would pass through the eye of a very small needle. Then the 3 princes set out once more, but the youngest mounted his wooden horse and repaired at once to the White Cat, who was rejoiced to see him, and the 2nd year passed as the first had done. When the day came round appointed by the King for the return of his sons, the 2 elder appeared before him, and without awaiting the arrival of their brother, displayed their pieces of linen, which were of a fineness quite astonishing. But although they would pass through the eye of a large needle, through the small needle the King had selected they would not go. There was much murmuring at this, and while the brothers were disputing the King's decision, a charming sound was heard of trumpets and other musical instruments. It was the youngest prince who arrived in a chariot with outriders and numerous attendants, all of which had been provided for him by the White Cat. After respectfully greeting his father and embracing his brothers, he took out of a jeweled box a nut which he broke. On breaking the nut he found a cherry stone. The stone was broken, and there was the kernel. In the kernel was a grain of corn. In the grain of corn a millet seed. And within that a piece of linen so fine that it passed 6 times through the smallest needle's eye. And moreover on it were exquisite paintings of people and places without number. The King heaved a deep sigh, and turning to his children, said, "Nothing pleases me in my old age so much as your deference to my desires, and I wish to prove you once more. Travel for a year, and who at the end of the year brings home the most beautiful girl shall marry her and be crowned king on his marriage. I promise you that I will not defer this reward any longer." Our Prince saw the injustice of all this. His little dog and piece of linen were worth 10 kingdoms, not only one, but he was too well brought up to go against his father's wishes, and mounting into his chariot with his retinue, he returned to the White Cat's castle. "Well, King's son," said the White Cat, "you have returned once more without your crown." "Madam," answered the Prince, "your gifts should have gained it for me, but I am convinced that the King would have more pain in giving it up than I should have pleasure in possessing it." "Never mind," she replied. "You shall not neglect anything that may deserve it. And if you must conduct a beautiful girl to your father's court, I will look for one so that you may gain the prize. Meanwhile, let us be happy." If the cat had not taken pains to remember the time when he must return to the court, the Prince would surely have forgotten it. On the evening before, she told him that she would bring to him one of the most beautiful princesses in the world, that at last the hour had arrived to destroy the fatal work of an evil fairy, and to do this he must make up his mind to cut off her head and tail, which he was at once to throw into the fire. "Ay!" cried the Prince. "Blanchette, that I love you, do you think I should be cruel enough to kill you? No doubt you wish to prove my heart, which will certainly never forget what I owe to you for your kindness." "No, King's son," she continued, "I don't think that you are ungrateful. Do this that I beseech you, and then we shall begin to be happy with one another. By the faith and honor of a cat, believe that I am truly your friend." Tears flowed from the Prince's eyes even at the thought, and he said all that he could to avoid it, but she urged him so vehemently that at last he took his sword and tremblingly cut off the head and tail of his dear friend the cat. In the same moment took place the most marvelous change imaginable. The body of the White Cat grew large, and was transformed into that of a girl. How, one could not say, one only knew that it was so. Her figure was majestic, her manners charming, her whole appearance beautiful beyond words. Then there entered an immense number of lords and ladies, who, carrying their cats' skins, or with them thrown across their shoulders, came and cast themselves at the feet of the Queen, expressing their joy at seeing her again in her rightful form. She received them all with a kindness which showed the goodness of her heart, and then turning to the Prince, she told the story of her life, and how by a wicked enchantment she had been transformed into a white cat. "But it is you, my Prince, who have freed me," she concluded. "As soon as I saw you I knew my troubles were at an end." They set out forthwith in a splendid carriage. As they drew near the castle, at the place where the three brothers were to meet, the Queen entered into a little crystal rock ornamented with precious stones, and this was carried by richly dressed young men. The Prince, who had remained in the carriage, saw his brothers approaching with wondrously beautiful ladies. On being questioned, he told them that all he had brought was a little white cat. They began to laugh at him, and drove on, followed by the young Prince, while after him was brought the crystal rock. Arrived at the palace, the two elder princes dismounted with their marvelous princesses. The King received them graciously, and did not know to which to award the prize. He looked at his youngest son, and said, "This time, then, you have come alone. Your Majesty will see in this rock a little white cat who mews sweetly and has soft little velvet paws," answered the Prince. The King smiled, and himself went to open the rock. But as he came near, the Queen, with a touch, made it shatter into pieces, and from out of it she appeared like the sun that had been hidden by clouds. Her fair hair was spread over her shoulders, and fell in waves to her feet, and she was robed in a gown of white and rose color. She made a deep curtsy to the king, who, struck with admiration, could not help exclaiming, "Here is the one who is matchless, and she deserves my crown." "Sire," she answered, "I have not come to take away the throne that you fill with such dignity. I was born heir to 6 kingdoms. Allow me to offer you one, and one of them I give to each of your sons. In return, all I ask of you is this young prince for my husband. We shall still have 3 kingdoms." The king and all the court uttered loud cries of joy. The marriage was at once celebrated, also that of the other 2 princes, and in such a manner that the court spent several months in fêtes of all sorts. Then each one of them departed to govern his kingdom, the White Cat making herself ever remembered as much by her kindness and generosity as by her rare merit and beauty. End of Chapter 11. Recording by David Gore.
Chapter 12 of my book of favorite fairy tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Finn Handyside, College Station, Texas. My Book of Favorite Fairy Tales by Edric Vredenberg. Chapter 12. Bluebeard. In the long ago times, in a splendid house, surrounded by fine gardens and a park, there lived a man who had riches in abundance, and everything to make him popular except one, and that was his beard, for his beard was neither black as a raven's wing, golden as the sunlight, nor just an ordinary everyday color, but it was blue, bright blue. Of course, had blue beards come into fashion, his would have been considered beautiful beyond words, but as far as we know, blue beards have never as yet been fashionable, nor are they likely to be so. However, in spite of his blue beard, this man had married several times, though what had become of his wives, nobody could say. Now, not far from Bluebeard's house, there dwelt a widow with 2 very lovely daughters, and one of these Bluebeard wished to marry, but which he did not mind. They might settle that between themselves. Neither of these girls had the least desire to have a husband with a blue beard, but also, not knowing the fate of the other wives, they did not like to risk disappearing from the world as those had done, but being very polite young women, they would not refuse Bluebeard's proposals outright. The younger said, "I would not for a moment take away Sister Anne's chance of marrying such a wealthy man," while Sister Anne declared, although the elder, she would much prefer to give way to her sister. And so it went on for some time. Then Bluebeard invited the widow and her daughters to spend a week with him, and many of their neighbors he also invited. Most sumptuous was the entertainment provided for them. Hunting and fishing expeditions, picnics and balls went on from morning till night, and all the night through, so that there was not even time to think of sleep, only feasting and pleasure the whole week long. So well, indeed, did the younger sister enjoy this, that by the end of the week she had begun to think perhaps after all her host's beard was not so very blue, and that it would be a fine thing to be the mistress of such a magnificent mansion and the wife of such a rich husband. And so, not long afterwards, there was a grand wedding, and the widow's younger daughter became Mrs. Bluebeard. About a month later, Bluebeard told his wife that he must leave her for several weeks, having to travel on business. "While I am absent, my dear," said he, "invite your relations and friends and enjoy yourself just as you please in entertaining them. See, here are my keys. the keys of the rooms and of the chests where I keep my money, my gold and silver plate, and my jewels. Unlock rooms and chests, and use freely what you will. This small key," he added, pointing to quite a little one, "is the key of the door at the end of the lower landing. You will not need to use this at all. In fact, should you open that door, or even put this key into the lock, I should be dreadfully angry. Indeed, I should make you suffer for it in a terrible way." Then Bluebeard bid his wife good-bye and departed. As soon as Mrs. Bluebeard's friends and relations knew that her husband was away, they came flocking to visit her, for they longed to see all her splendid possessions, but had feared to come before. They could not enough admire the magnificent apartments, and ran from one to another, praising everything they beheld. But the young wife heeded nothing they said or did. All she thought of was that little key which she must not use, wondering more and more why she ought not to open that one particular door. At last she could bear it no longer, but slipping away from her visitor, she ran along the passages and stairs, nearly falling down them, so great was her haste, until she came to that door at the end of the corridor. Not pausing an instant, she thrust the key into the lock, and the door sprang open. At first she could distinguish nothing, for the room was dark and gloomy. But then, all of a sudden, she knew what had become of Bluebeard's other wives, for there they lay, in a long straight row, all dead. She stood horrified for a moment or two, gazing at the pale faces and long hair spread out around them. Then, picking up the little key which she had taken from the lock but dropped in her fright, she hastily quitted the room, shut and locked the door, and ran to her own chamber to calm herself before returning to her guests. But she was unable to rest for an instant, so dreadful were her feelings. Then with terror she noticed that on the key there was a stain. She wiped it with her handkerchief, but alas, it was blood that would not be wiped away. She washed the key and rubbed it, and scraped it, and polished it, but all to no purpose. If she succeeded in cleansing one side, the mark came out on the other, for the key was enchanted. That same evening Bluebeard returned, saying he had met the man whom he was wanting to see, and so the long journey was unnecessary, and he was rejoiced to be at home again. Next morning he called for the keys. His wife brought them to him, but not the little one. That she left behind. Bluebeard noticed this directly and sent her to fetch it. Trembling and white as a sheet, she was forced to give it into his hand. "Ha! What is this?" he cried. "What is this stain that I see?" His poor wife trembled still more and could not speak. "Wretched woman!" shouted Bluebeard. "You have used this key. You have unlocked the door of that room at the end of the passage. You shall die." In vain did his wife plead with him to spare her, kneeling before him with tears streaming from her eyes. "You shall die!" he cried again, more savagely than before. "Let me have a few moments alone to prepare for death." "Half a quarter of an hour, but not a moment longer," he replied, and left her. The poor young woman hastened to a room at the foot of the turret stairs, where was her sister Anne, and called to her. "Sister Anne, Sister Anne, look from the tower window. Can you see no one coming?" And Sister Anne, looking out, answered, "Alas, no, nothing but the green grass and the sun which shines upon it." Bluebeard shouted from below that the time was almost up. Sister Anne, look once again. Can you see no one coming?" whispered the young wife, wringing her hands. Her brothers, she knew, were to visit her that day. If only they would come in time. "Alas, no," Sister Anne replied. "I see a cloud of dust, but it is only a flock of sheep on the road." But now Bluebeard bawled out so loudly for his wife to come down that the whole house shook. Sister Anne, tell me, is no one coming?" "I see 2 horsemen afar off," cried Sister Anne. "I will beckon to them to hasten hither." But Bluebeard would wait not a moment longer, and nearly dead with terror, his wife descended, still entreating him to spare her life. He would not, however, give heed to her prayers, and was just brandishing his sword, so that it might come down straight and true upon her slender neck, when the door burst open, and 2 young army officers came rushing in, whom Bluebeard recognized as the brothers of his wife. He swiftly fled, but they speedily followed, and for his many crimes slew him then and there. All his wealth now belonged to his widow, and she gratefully rewarded her brothers by purchasing them commissions in the army. She settled a large sum of money upon her sister, and after a while she married again, and, with a good husband, lived a happy life. End of Chapter 12. Recording by Finn Handyside, College Station, Texas.
Chapter 13 of my book of favorite fairy tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by phone. My book of favorite fairy tales by Edric Vredenberg. Beauty and the Beast. Once upon a time, a long while ago, there was a beast. He was a great beast and lived in a great castle that stood in the middle of a great park, and everybody in the country held the beast in great fear. In fact, everything about the beast was great. His roar was great and terrific and could be heard for miles around the park, and when he roared the people trembled. Nobody ever saw the beast, which was by no means remarkable, for the beast never came out of his park, and no one, I can assure you, ever ventured onto his estate. But matters were not allowed to remain like this forever, for something very wonderful happened to the beast and to somebody else, and if that something had not happened, this story would never have been written. About 2 miles and 3/4 from the castle gates there lived a rich merchant and his 3 daughters. The 2 elder girls were ugly, disagreeable things, and although they had all they could wish for to make them happy, they were always grumbling. But the youngest daughter, whose name was Beauty, was very pretty, and her nature was happy and good, her presence was sunshine, and she was the joy of her father's heart. Well, one day the 2 elder sisters had something to grumble about with a vengeance, for a telegram arrived to say that the merchant was no longer a rich merchant, for he had lost all his money. So the horses and carriages had to be sold, and everything that was of value was got rid of, the servants were sent away, and the merchant and his daughters had to do their own work. Dear me, it was shocking, the way those 2 sisters grumbled. But Beauty, oh dear no, she was all smiles, for her heart was as sunny as ever, as she rolled up the sleeves of her print frock, and cooked the dinner, and scrubbed the floors, and made herself useful, here, there, and everywhere. Things had been going on like this for about 3 months, when one fine morning another telegram boy came with another telegram to say that somebody who owed the merchant a great deal of money was ready to pay the debt, and all the merchant had to do was go to the city and get it. Of course, everybody was delighted at this good news, and the merchant didn't waste any time, but started off to the city at once. "Mind you bring me something back," said the eldest daughter as he was starting. "What shall it be?" asked the merchant. "A white satin dress trimmed with lace and pearls," said his eldest daughter. "And you must bring me something too, please, father," said the second daughter. "And what do you want?" asked the merchant. "A purse full of gold so that I can buy what I want myself," said the second daughter. "I will try and do what you both ask," he said. "And what shall I bring for my Beauty?" "I will wait a little for my dresses and things," replied the smiling Beauty, as she helped her father on with his cloak. but I should like you to bring me home a rose, a lovely red rose, if you can." So her father kissed her, and promised he would bring her the rose, and went on his way full of hopes. What a pity it is that our hopes cannot be always realized, and that we are so often doomed to disappointment! When the merchant arrived at the city, to his dismay he found that the man who owed him the money was still unable to pay him. The man had been disappointed himself at the last moment. So the unhappy father had to return home without the white satin dress trimmed with lace and pearls, and without the bag of money, and he dreaded meeting his 2 daughters, for he knew they would be terribly angry. Now on his way home from the station to his house, he had to pass by part of the wall that surrounded the great park where the great beast lived in his great castle, and as he passed by a corner of the wall, what should he see hanging just over the top, and just within his reach if he stood on his toes, but a lovely red rose. "At any rate I can take my Beauty what she asked for," he said to himself, and, without so much as giving a thought to the wrong he was doing, he stood on his toes and plucked the rose. He was sorry he did it. Of a sudden there was a roar, such a roar that the very ground shook, and as to the poor merchant he quivered like a leaf. Enough to make him quiver indeed, for a gate in the wall suddenly opened, and out rushed the beast. Yes, the beast, if you please, and he seized the merchant by the scruff of his neck, and dragged him into the park, and shut the gate after him. "Don't you know it's a sin to steal?" roared the beast. "How dare you steal my roses? I am going to kill you." "Oh, mercy, Mr. Beast!" cried the unhappy man, flinging himself on his knees before the monster. "I'm going to kill you!" roared the beast still more loudly. "It's taken years to cultivate this sort of rose, and I'm going to kill you. Unless," he added after a pause, "you send me one of your daughters here instead." "All right," said the merchant, and got on his feet again. "She must be here tomorrow by breakfast time, and I breakfast early," said the beast, as he let the merchant out of the gate. "If she is not here, I shall come for you, and don't you forget it." It was by no means likely that he would forget it, in fact, he could think of nothing else. He hurried home and told his dreadful news, and received a dreadful scolding from his 2 elder daughters, who were angry at not getting their presents. "And it is Beauty's fault that you have got into this trouble," they said. "Beauty and her stupid rose. Beauty had better get you out of the trouble." Beauty said little, but smiled on, with sunshine in her heart, and trust in her loving nature, and cooked the dinner. Early next morning, when the dawn was breaking, she left her father's house, leaving a little note behind her, begging him not to be anxious, but that she had gone to the beast's castle. When she came to the gate in the wall, she knocked upon it 3 times, and it opened as if by magic, for she could see no one. And she stepped into the garden of red roses, and in the distance across the park she saw the castle, and she thought she had never seen anything so beautiful. For it was built of mother of pearl, and the red and yellow gleams of the rising sun shone upon its glistening walls, and lit them up with 1,000 radiant lights. Beauty marveled at the loveliness, and walked on. And when she arrived at this beautiful castle, the huge gates opened as if by magic, and the doors opened as if by magic, for never a soul did she see, nor living thing of any sort. And in the great hall was the breakfast table laid for 2. It was a nice breakfast, with steaming hot dishes, and jams, honey, and hot rolls, and brightly polished silver, and sweet flowers. Then the beast appeared suddenly from behind the curtain. Oh, he was an awful beast, and Beauty's heart beat fast. But he seemed a polite beast for all that. He handed Beauty a chair, and when she had sat down, said, "I bid you welcome. Which do you take, tea or coffee?" "Tea, please," answered Beauty. "Then pour it out," he said, "and I'll take tea too, please. Eggs, do you like eggs hard or soft?" "I always cook mine 3 minutes and a half," replied Beauty. "Half a minute too much, I think, but you shall have just what you like." And so she had, not only at the breakfast table, but in everything. She had only to express a wish, and it was immediately gratified. She had ponies to ride, and dogs and cats, and pet birds, and the most beautiful dresses ever worn by real princesses. And if it had not been that she was far away from her father, she would really have been happy. The beast was most kind and attentive to her, and told her that he loved her, and 3 times a day he asked her to marry him, But Beauty shook her head and said, oh no, she couldn't. Well, Beauty had been at the great castle some time, when she began to pine to go home and see her father, and she begged the Beast to let her go. Very good, he said with a great sigh. You may go home today, but promise me that you will be back early tomorrow morning. If you do not come back early, I am sure I shall die, for I love you so dearly. So Beauty promised and went home, and she took presents for her father and her sisters, and when the sisters heard of all the wonderful things at the great castle, they were envious and jealous, and made up their minds to do Beauty and the Beast a great injury. So they mixed something in Beauty's supper that made her sleep nearly all the next day, and so she did not keep her promise. It was evening when she arrived at the gate in the wall, instead of early morning. But she knocked 3 times and the gate opened by magic, and she went through the garden and hurried to the castle, that shone like fire in the light of the setting sun. And the huge gates opened by magic, and the doors opened by magic, and she stood in the great hall, but there was no Beast there. She searched in all the rooms, but he was not there. With fear and anxiety in her heart she ran into the gardens, and there she found him at last. Found him lying stretched out on the grass, and she thought he was dead. Oh, dear darling Beast, she cried, as she threw herself on her knees beside him, and raised his ugly head. Dear Beast, do not die, for I love you with all my heart, and will marry you tomorrow. And she kissed him. Then of a sudden he sprang to his feet, but no longer the Beast, no longer a hideous monster, but a beautiful prince, most beautifully dressed. Dearest, he said, a wicked fairy turned me into this brute form until a day should come when a good girl like you should tell me that she loved me, and you will marry me tomorrow. Oh yes, answered Beauty, but the wicked fairy could not change your nature. I would have married you if you had remained just as you were. And so they married and lived happy ever afterwards, and they took care of Beauty's father until the end of his days. So he was happy, and they forgave the 2 sisters and gave them fine dresses and jewels, and the 2 sisters turned over a new leaf and were less selfish, and they were happy, so this is a very happy ending to the story. What a pity all stories can't end the same way. End of Beauty and the Beast.
Chapter 14 of my book of favorite fairy tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My Book of Favorite Fairy Tales by Edric Vredenberg. Chapter 14 Ch15 The White Cat. There was once upon a time a queen who had the ugliest little baby imaginable, so ugly indeed that it was almost impossible to believe he was a little boy at all. A fairy, however, assured his mother that the little baby would be very good and clever, saying that she was also giving him a gift which would enable him to make that person whom he loved the best as clever as himself. This somewhat consoled the queen, but still she was very unhappy because her son was so ugly, though no sooner had he begun to speak than he could talk about all sorts of things, and he had such pretty ways that people were charmed with him. I forgot to say that when he was quite a baby, he had a funny little tuft of hair on his head, so he was called Ch15 The White Cat, for Riquette was the family name. When Riquette was about 7 years old, the queen of a kingdom nearby was given 2 baby daughters, twins, of which one was so exquisitely beautiful that the queen nearly died of joy when she saw her, and so the fairy, the same one who had given Riquette his gift of cleverness, to keep the queen from making herself ill with excitement, told her that this little princess would not be at all clever. Indeed, she would be as stupid as she was beautiful. The queen was very much grieved at this, and felt still more troubled when she beheld her other daughter, for the second princess was extremely ugly. "Do not take it too much to heart, madam," remarked the fairy, "for this second daughter will be so clever that it will scarcely be noticed that she is not beautiful. "Well, if it must be so, it must," remarked the queen. "But I should certainly have liked the elder one, who is beautiful, to be just a little bit clever, too." "I can do nothing as to her mind, madam," replied the fairy. "But for her beauty I can, and as there is nothing I would not do to please you, I will give her a gift so that she can make the one who wins her heart beautiful too." As the princesses grew up, their gifts likewise grew with them, so that everybody spoke about the beauty of the one and the cleverness of the other. But also their defects grew, so that it could not but be noticed that the younger was daily uglier, and the elder day by day became more stupid, until she either said nothing in reply to a question, or something quite silly, and so clumsy was she that she could not arrange 4 china ornaments on the chimney-piece without breaking one, or drink a glass of water without spilling half of it on her frock. Although it is a great thing to have beauty, yet the younger generally received more attention in company than her elder sister. At first, everybody would gather around the beautiful one admiringly, but before long they would leave her for the clever princess, to listen to her pleasant conversation, and by the end of a quarter of an hour the elder would be left alone, while the other would be the center of a group. This the elder sister noticed in spite of her stupidity, and she would gladly have given all her beauty for half the cleverness of her sister. And sometimes the queen, although full of kindness, would reproach her daughter for her foolishness, which caused the princess almost to die of grief. One day, when she had retreated to a wood to brood over her unhappiness, she saw a little man coming towards her. He was uncommonly ugly and unpleasing in appearance, but was very richly dressed. It was the young Prince Tufty Riquet, who had fallen in love with the pictures he had seen of her, and had left his father's kingdom for the sake of making her acquaintance. Delighted to meet her alone in this manner, he accosted her as courteously as possible, but soon noticing that she was melancholy, he said, "I cannot understand how it is that anyone as beautiful as you are can be as sad as you appear to be, for I must own that although I can boast of having seen many beauties, not one have I ever met whose beauty equaled yours." "It pleases you to say so, sir," replied the princess, and relapsed into silence. "Beauty," went on Riquet, "is so delightful that one would give everything for it, and if anyone is beautiful, I can't understand anything troubling greatly." "I would rather be as ugly as you," answered the princess, "and be clever than as beautiful as I am and be stupid." "To think you are stupid is a sure sign that you have a certain amount of cleverness, madam," replied Riquet.
"I don't think about that," said the princess, "but I am quite sure that I am very silly, and the grief of that is killing me."
"If that is all that troubles you, I can soon put an end to your grief," said Riquet, "for I have the power of giving cleverness to the person whom I love the best, and if only you will marry me, you shall become as clever as you can wish."
The princess was greatly astonished, but remained silent.
"I can see," continued Riquet, "that this proposal is not to your taste, and I am not astonished. I will give you a year to think about it."
So great was the longing of the princess to be clever, that she at once promised Riquet to marry him in a year's time, and no sooner had she made the promise than a great change took place in her,
and she found she could say all sorts of pleasant things on all sorts of subjects in quite an easy manner. She at once began a conversation with Riquet, making such brilliant remarks that he could almost think he had given her all his cleverness and had kept none for himself. When the princess returned to the palace, everybody was astonished at the sudden and extraordinary change, for instead of saying stupid things, or just nothing at all, she was now full of beautiful ideas which she expressed most charmingly. The report of this transformation was soon spread abroad, and all the young princes of the neighboring kingdoms asked for her hand in marriage, but not one did she find altogether suitable. However, at last one arrived, who was so powerful, rich, clever, and handsome that she could not help approving of him, and her father, noticing this, told her she was quite free to choose what husband she wished. The princess thanked him and asked for time to consider the matter. Then, to think it over, she went by chance into the wood where she had met Tufty Riquet. While she was walking, deep in thought, she noticed a loud noise beneath her feet, as of many persons hastening to and fro. Then, listening attentively, she heard a voice say, "Bring me the saucepan," and another voice cry, "Put some wood on the fire." At the same moment the earth opened, and she saw a big kitchen full of cooks, and all sorts of things necessary for the making of a magnificent banquet, and everybody hard at work. The princess, astonished at this sight, asked the men for whom they were working. "For the Prince Tufty Riquet," answered the head cook, "for tomorrow is his wedding day." The princess, more surprised than ever, all at once recollected that it was just a year ago that very day that she had promised to marry the ugly Tufty Riquet. The reason that she had not remembered her promise before was that she was foolish when she made it, and in becoming clever she had forgotten all her former stupidities. She had only walked on a few steps further when Riquet appeared before her, magnificently clad as a prince about to marry. "Here you see me, madam," said he, "keeping my word, and I have no doubt that you also came here to keep yours, and by giving me your hand to make me the happiest of men." "I frankly confess," replied the princess, "that I have not yet made up my mind, and I do not think I can ever do as you wish." "You surprise me, madam," said Riquet. "I can quite believe that," said the princess, "and if you were not a good and clever man, I should not know how to act. But you are well aware that it was when I was stupid I promised to marry you. But now, as you may imagine, I am not so easily pleased." "Except for my ugliness," said Riquet, "have you anything against me? Do you object to my birth, my character, or my manners?" "Not at all," replied the princess. "I love those things in you." "If that is so," answered Riquet, "I shall indeed be made happy, because you can cause me to become the most delightful of men, if only you will desire it. For know, madam, the same fairy who at my birth gave me the power to impart cleverness to whomsoever I should love, gave you a gift also, that of being able to render beautiful the one to whom you would grant this favor." "If that is the case," exclaimed the princess, "I desire with all my heart that you might be the most handsome and pleasing prince in the world." No sooner had the princess uttered these words than her wish was fulfilled, though some say that no change really took place in Riquet, but that the princess loved him now so much that all his ugliness was seen as beauty by her eyes. However that may be, she straightway consented to be his bride, and, as the preparations had already been made, the wedding took place the very next day. End of Chapter 14. Tufty Riquet.
Chapter 15 of my book of favorite fairy tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. My book of favorite fairy tales by Edric Vredenberg. Thumbling. There was once a poor woodsman sitting by the fire in his cottage, and his wife sat by his side spinning. "How lonely it is," said he, "for you and me to sit here by ourselves without any children to play about and amuse us, while other people seem so happy and merry with their children." "What you say is very true," said the wife, sighing and turning her wheel. "How happy should I be if I had but one child, and if it were ever so small, nay, if it were no bigger than my thumb, I should be very happy and love it dearly." Now, it came to pass that this good woman's wish was fulfilled just as she desired, for, some time afterwards, she had a little boy, who was quite healthy and strong, but not much bigger than my thumb. So they said, "Well, we cannot say we have not got what we wished for, and, little as he is, we will love him dearly," and they called him Thumbling. They gave him plenty of food, yet he never grew bigger, but remained just the same size as when he was born. Still his eyes were sharp and sparkling, and he soon showed himself to be a clever little fellow, who always knew well what he was about. One day, as the woodman was getting ready to go into the wood to cut fuel, he said, "I wish I had some one to bring the cart after me, for I want to make haste." "Oh, father," cried Thumbling, "I will take care of that. The cart shall be in the wood by the time you want it." Then the woodsman laughed and said, "How can that be? You cannot reach up to the horse's bridle." "Never mind that, father," said Thumbling. "If my mother will only harness the horse, I will get into his ear, and tell him which way to go." "Well," said the father, "we will try for once." When the time came, the mother harnessed the horse to the cart, and put Thumbling into its ear, and, as he sat there, the little man told the beast how to go, crying out, "Go on," and "Stop," as he wanted. So the horse went on just as if the woodsman had driven it himself into the wood. It happened that, as the horse was going a little too fast, and Thumbling was calling out, "Gently, gently," two strangers came up. "What an odd thing that is," said one. "There is a cart going along, and I hear a carter talking to the horse, but can see no one." "That is strange," said the other. "Let us follow the cart and see where it goes." So they went on into the wood, till at last they came to the place where the woodman was. Then Thumbling, seeing his father, cried out, "See, father, here I am with the cart. all right and safe. Now take me down." So his father took hold of the horse with one hand, and with the other took his son out of the ear, then put him down upon a straw, where he sat as merry as you please. The two strangers were all this time looking on, and did not know what to say for wonder. At last one took the other aside and said: "This little urchin will make our fortune if we can get him and carry him about from town to town as a show. We must buy him." So they went to the woodsman and asked him what he would take for the little man. "He will be better off," said they, "with us than with you." "I won't sell him at all," said the father. "My own flesh and blood is dearer to me than all the silver and gold in the world." But Thumbling, hearing of the bargain they wanted to make, crept up his father's coat to his shoulder, and whispered in his ear: "Take the money, father, and let them have me. I'll soon come back to you." So the woodsman at last agreed to sell Thumbling to the strangers for a large piece of gold. "Where do you like to sit?" said one of them. "Oh, put me on the rim of your hat. That will be a nice gallery for me. I can walk about there, and see the country as we go along." So they did as he wished, and when Thumbling had taken leave of his father, they carried him away with them. They journeyed till it began to be dusky, and then the little man said: "Let me get down, I'm tired." So the man took off his hat and set him down on a clod of earth in a ploughed field by the side of the road. But Thumbling ran about amongst the furrows, and at last slipped into a mouse hole. "Good night, masters," said he, "I'm off. Mind and look sharp after me the next time." They ran directly to the place, and poked the ends of their sticks into the mouse hole, but all in vain. Thumbling only crawled farther and farther in, and at last it became quite dark, so they were obliged to go their way without their prize, as sulky as you please. When Thumbling found they were gone, he came out of his hiding place. "What dangerous walking it is," said he, "in this ploughed field. If I were to fall from one of these great clods, I should certainly break my neck." At last, by good chance, he found a large empty snail shell. "This is lucky," said he; "I can sleep here very well." And in he crept. Just as he was falling asleep he heard two men passing, and one said to the other: "How shall we manage to steal that rich parson's silver and gold?" "I'll tell you," cried Thumbling. "What noise was that?" said the thief, frightened. "I am sure I heard some one speak." They stood still listening, and Thumbling said: "Take me with you, and I'll show you how to get the parson's money." "But where are you?" said they. "Look about on the ground," answered he, "and listen where the sound comes from." At last the thieves found him out, and lifted him up in their hands. "You little urchin," said they, "what can you do for us?" "Why, I can get between the iron window bars of the parson's house, and throw you out whatever you want." "That's a good thought," said the thieves. "Come along, we shall see what you can do." When they came to the parson's house, Thumbling slipped through the window bars into the room, and then called out as loudly as he could bawl: "Will you have all that is here?" At this the thieves were frightened, and said: "Softly, softly, speak low, that you may not awaken anybody." But Thumbling pretended not to understand them, and bawled out again: "How much will you have? Shall I throw it all out?" Now the cook lay in the next room, and hearing a noise, she raised herself in her bed and listened. Meanwhile the thieves were frightened and ran off to a little distance. But at last they plucked up courage and said, "The little urchin is only trying to make fools of us." So they came back and whispered softly to him, saying, "Now, let us have no more of your jokes, but throw out some of the money." Then Thumbling called out as loudly as he could, "Very well, hold out your hands, here it comes." The cook heard this quite plainly, so she sprang out of bed and ran to open the door. The thieves rushed off as if a wolf were at their heels, and the maid, having groped about and found nothing, went away for a light. By the time she returned, Thumbling had slipped off into the barn, and when the cook had looked about and searched every hole and corner and found nobody, she went to bed, thinking she must have been dreaming with her eyes open. The little man crawled about in the hay loft, and at last found a glorious place to finish his night's rest in. So he laid himself down, meaning to sleep till daylight, and then find his way home to his father and mother. But, alas! how cruelly he was disappointed. What crosses and sorrows happen in this world! The cook got up early, before daybreak, to feed the cows. She went straight to the hay loft, and carried away a large bundle of hay with the little man in the middle of it fast asleep. He still, however, slept on, and did not wake till he found himself in the mouth of the cow, who had taken him up with a mouthful of hay. "Good lack a day!" said he, "how did I manage to tumble into the mill?" But he soon found out where he really was, and was obliged to have all his wits about him, in order that he might not get between the cow's teeth, and be crushed to death. At last she swallowed him down. "It's rather dark here," said he. "They forgot to build windows in this room to let the sun in. A candle would be no bad thing." Though he made the best of his bad luck, he did not like his quarters at all, and the worst of it was, that more and more hay was always coming down, and the space in which he was became smaller and smaller. At last he cried out as loudly as he could, "Don't bring me any more hay! Don't bring me any more hay!" The maid happened to be just then milking the cow, and hearing someone speak, and seeing nobody, and yet being quite sure it was the same voice that she had heard in the night, she was so much frightened that she fell off her stool and overset the milk pail. She ran off as fast as she could to her master, the parson, and said, "Sir, sir, the cow is talking." But the parson said, "Woman, thou art surely mad." However, he went with her into the cow house to see what was the matter. Scarcely had they set their feet on the threshold, when Thumbling called out, "Don't bring me any more hay." Then the parson himself was frightened, and thinking the cow was surely bewitched, ordered that she should be killed directly. So the cow was killed, and the part in which Thumbling lay was thrown away. Thumbling soon set himself to work to get out, which was not a very easy task; but at last, just as he had made room to get his head through, a new misfortune befell him. A hungry wolf passed by and swallowed Thumbling and all at a single gulp, and ran away. Thumbling, however, was not disheartened, and thinking the wolf would not dislike having some chat with him as he was going along, he called out, "My good friend, I can show you a famous treat. where's that?" said the wolf. "In such and such a house," said Thumbling, describing the father's house. "You can crawl through the drain into the kitchen, and there you will find cakes, ham, beef, and everything your heart can desire." The wolf did not want to be asked twice, so that very night he went to the house, and crawled through the drain into the kitchen, and ate and drank there to his heart's content. As soon as he was satisfied, he wanted to get away, but he had eaten so much that he could not get out the same way that he came in. This was just what Thumbling had reckoned upon, and he now began to set up a great shout, making all the noise he could. "Will you be quiet?" said the wolf. "You'll awaken everybody in the house." "What's that to me?" said the little man. "You have had your frolic, now I've a mind to be merry myself." And he began again singing and shouting as loudly as he could. The woodsman and his wife, being awakened by the noise, peeped through a crack in the door; but when they saw that the wolf was there, you may well suppose that they were terribly frightened, and the woodsman ran for his axe, and gave his wife a scythe. "Now, do you stay behind," said the woodsman, "and when I have knocked him on the head, do you cut him open with the scythe." Thumbling heard all this, and said, "Father, father, I am here; the wolf has swallowed me." And his father said, "Heaven be praised! We have found our dear child again." And he told his wife not to use the scythe, for fear she should hurt him. Then he aimed a great blow, and struck the wolf on the head, and killed him on the spot. And when he was dead, they cut open his body, and set Thumbling free. "Ah," said the father, "what fears we have had for you!" "Yes, father," answered he, "I have travelled all over the world since we parted, in one way or another, and now I am very glad to get fresh air again." "Why, where have you been?" said the father. "I have been in a mouse hole, in a snail shell, down a cow's throat, and inside the wolf, and yet here I am again safe and sound." "Well," said they, "we will not sell you again for all the riches in the world." So they hugged and kissed their dear little son, and gave him plenty to eat and drink, and fetched new clothes for him, for his old ones were quite spoiled on the journey. End of chapter 15. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. End of my book of favorite fairy tales by Edric Vredenberg.